Chapter 19 is titled Protest and Reform, the Waning of the Old Order, 1400 to 1600. This chapter deals with probably the most important shift in European history, or even history in the West. At around 1500, we have this major turn. Everything shifted in the way religion was carried out, the way politics were considered as how they functioned in the earth, whether they were part of the authority of the church, whether they were in themselves entities. The entire concept of religion and Catholicism, all that began to change. And so we really pinpoint 1500. That's why the 1301 version of this course ends at this point, and the 1302 version of this course begins at this point, because that is the shift where we move into the modern era. Everything, all the medieval and Middle Ages, all those darker, less intellectual times began to shift, and free thinking and free thought and intellectual inquiry comes at a new level, and it becomes more accessible. And there's many things that contributed to this, and one of which is the movable type printing press. And it made material, written and typed material, available to people at a level that it had never before been available. And so where we take pretty much for granted that we have access to, scores of papers and books and pamphlets, to the people at that time, they were amazed to be able to have some of those things. And literally propaganda or pamphlets or tracts or however you want to look at it, those things transformed the way people viewed the world, because they had never had that kind of medium to carry a message. It's beyond dispute that the spread of printing and the emergence of print shops in the major cities of Europe at this time not only enabled the revival of learning, but also it disseminated this message of reform in ways never before thought possible. And it's actually, some scholars say it's inconceivable that the Reformation could have taken place if it wasn't for printing, if it wasn't for this new process of printing. And Luther himself is quoted as saying he believed that the printing press was God's latest and best work to spread the true religion throughout the world. And Luther actually proves this. I mean, I always say Luther said a lot of things, some of which sound good and some of which sound really bad, and at times he said some things that were mean and ugly and nasty and hateful and anti-Semitic, and at times he said some really valuable things. But I think in Luther's case, he just pretty much printed everything he ever wrote, and that can be bad, because if somebody was to record a person saying everything they have ever said their entire life and was recorded, there's a lot of things that we could all probably wish we hadn't said. And unfortunately for Luther, he went down in history as a man who said, I think, too much. But he really put the printing press to work. In the years after the publication of his very first sermon on indulgences and grace, that was kind of his bestseller, Luther's sermon production and the production and printing of those sermons increased. In the years from 1518 to 1525, Luther published over 200 works in the vernacular. And that's another thing that was really important at this time, is that these works were being put out in a language people could understand. People were able to understand these Christian ideals in German. I mean, before the Reformation, if you went to the Catholic Mass, it was going to be in Latin. And if you didn't know Latin, then, well, you didn't know Latin. So you didn't know what was going on, and you just sort of hoped everything worked out. And that was one of the major shifts that came, is that religious materials began to be produced in the vernacular, in German and other languages. But his works were, reprinted numerous times, so that over 1,800 editions of Luther's works had come out of the presses by the end of 1525. 2 out of every 5 printings through this period were sermons, and 1 in every 3 were sermons until 1530. And so these handy, cheap publications, which flooded the German-speaking market, focused on devotional and pastoral issues, stressing that Christians should acknowledge their own sinfulness and surrender all reliance on their works, and second, that they should trust God and God's promise in Christ as their only salvation. Now, again, that might seem like a very normal term or concept in the sort of Western theology, But at the time, to really trust in God alone, apart from the work of the sacraments, was kind of a radical concept. And it wasn't kind of a radical concept. It was radical. And it changed the world. So needless to say, the printing press was the technological innovation that spurred the Protestant Reformation. But in order to understand Martin Luther, we have to understand the intellectual backdrop from which he emerged. He came out of this period of time where he was coming out of this medieval scholastic philosophy, and I could go into some of that, but it's really abstract, and a lot of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But there was realism and nominalism kind of ideas that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. But anyway, so the phasing out of this medieval scholastic philosophy mixed with this distaste for the Catholic Church and, laity as well as scholars, and there was this renaissance of humanism. I mean, this whole period was rich with all of these new concepts and ideas and feelings and emotions. But part of this backdrop of the Reformation is this movement known as the Devotio Moderna, which is basically just modern devotion, if we were to put it in English. But Devotio Moderna, it was first coined in the 1420s by a man named Henry Pomerius, but it actually dates back to a movement that began in the 1300s in the aftermath of and in response to the Black Death and subsequent bouts of epidemic plague that were spreading across the Low Countries in Germany and France and parts of Italy. And this movement, this Devotio Moderna, it comes out with this emphasis on the original simplicity of the early church and its faith. And some call this apostolic Christianity, to go back to, how were the apostles in the book of Acts? How were they Christian? What kind of Christianity is simplicity? It was kind of a pre-Catholic concept of being Christian. And it appealed to lay people, just the regular churchgoers, and it appealed to clerics. Clergy were responding to this Devotio Moderna movement by living more holy and devout and keeping the vows they had taken. And lay people were especially attracted by an emphasis on this inner devotional life. And I think that was probably the real key to the Devotio Moderna, was this. There was a devotional life that the believer could have apart from the church's institutional means of salvation. And this whole Devotio Moderna movement started in the Netherlands. And really, they give credit back to this guy, Geert Groot. I suppose that's how you say his name. I think that's Dutch, and I can't say that. So in some versions of his name, they call him Gerard. So maybe we'll call him Gerard. But he started preaching in Dutch. And again, like I said, Latin was the vernacular. I mean, that was the tongue that the church spoke in. There was no Dutch preaching. And so when he comes out, he starts preaching in Dutch. And he tried to combine a genuine heartfelt piety with a deep appreciation for learning, and fostered that double appreciation in those he converted. In a complex and multifaceted movement, this Devotio Moderna, it was primarily, like I said, it was like a lay, like a church attenders revival in a sense, but it was also accompanied by monastic and educational reform. The systematic meditations that were central to Devotio Moderna piety focused on episodes in Christ's life. Each meditation was intended to set the tone for the entire day, a constant refrain that was to be in the mental background of all the day's other activities. So you have a concept and you think about something Christ did, and you would meditate on that all day long. Literate practitioners of the Devotio Moderna kept spiritual notebooks and journals, and they wrote down their experiences of their inner seeking devotional life. And one of the all-time epic pieces of devotional literature, historically that is by a man named Thomas à Kempis, and it's called The Imitation of Christ. And this whole concept of this book grew out of the practice that was developed in the Devotio Moderna. And Thomas à Kempis was a monk, actually, in an Augustinian house, and he was, in fact, a Devotio Moderna order. And one of a large number, it was actually one of the large Reformed monasteries that arose in that period of time. But what's notable is this imitatio Christi, as you would say in, I guess, Latin, but it's the imitation of Christ. And it was the most frequently published book in the Christian West well into modern times. So basically, you had the Bible as the all-time bestseller, reprinted, disseminated, dispersed text, and then second to that, coming out of this period well into today, is this imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. So in some senses, reform was well underway by the time Luther shows up in the 1500s, and in fact, it was already almost a mass movement. And so we do give a lot of credit to Luther, but these ideas of Renaissance and rebirth and this idea of new thinking, a new modern devotion, was already beginning to move forward, and Luther kind of steps in on the tail end of it, and he really becomes the mouthpiece for us for this. And two specific examples of this backdrop, one being the Devotio Moderna and the second being humanism, also really describes this intellectual milieu of thinking at the time. And in their own way, these two movements were changing not only the way people thought about religion in the church, but also the way in which they practiced their own faith and worshiped God. I mean, again, this was an intellectual movement, but they were all, they weren't atheists. They were all believers. And the changes were slow, and they were often minimal and usually seemed inconsequential. But cumulatively, over time, both movements, the Devotio Moderna and humanism, they laid much of the groundwork for what was to follow in the Reformation. In Luther's time, the Devotio Moderna was already so widespread as to have lost some of its distinctive edge, and he came in contact with the movement in his final phase about 100 years after its inception. But humanism, on the other hand, was a strong and fervent contemporary movement during the Reformation. Among the great humanists of this era are Melanchthon and Erasmus. In fact, I visited Lutherstadt Wittenberg in Germany a couple years ago, and when I walked into the central square of the city, it's a very small town, but I walked into the central plaza, and there's two statues. You have this giant, 10, 12, 15 foot tall statue of Luther, and then this other man. And at the time, I didn't know who he was, honestly, and I walked over and I began to read the plaque, and it was Melanchthon, and who was also part of the university there in that town. And he is a humanist. And so I found it interesting that, we all very much so understand and know who Luther is, but there's also his contemporary at the time who was really actually pretty significant to Lutheranism and is pretty significant to the intellectual movement that was behind the Reformation, which was humanism. So the reformer and educator, Philip Melanchthon, the author of several of the foundational documents of the Lutheran Church, and he also led the church after Martin Luther died. He was a friend and colleague of Luther at Wittenberg, and Melanchthon was a powerful influence on the movement's shape and dissemination. While Luther was noted for his fiery temper and vocal proclamations, his counterpart Philip here, he was quieter, he was a teacher, and he was a theologian. In 1518, at the age of 21, and on the recommendation of his great uncle, Melanchthon was appointed to the Greek professorship at the University of Wittenberg, which was actually founded by Frederick the Wise, who was somebody that had Luther's back during the Reformation. He was a prince, he was an elector of Saxony, but in 1502 he founded the University of Wittenberg, which is where Luther and Philip Melanchthon both served. Melanchthon was more sensitive than Luther and was more easily disturbed by the course of things. Despite his keen way of thinking, Melanchthon was more moderate in form, so that in contrast, Luther appeared coarse. And if you've read any significant amount of Luther's works, he was very coarse. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for Luther to even use some profanity in some of the things he wrote. Like I said, the guy said some good things, the guy said some bad things. He wrote it all down. Unfortunately, he'll forever be known for the good and the bad. But Melanchthon was a humanist, and he remained a humanist even as he became a reformer. He had been and remained, moreover, a staunch admirer of Erasmus, and Erasmus is a very significant and very important figure in the Reformation. He, the most illustrious of humanists, challenged the most controversial of theologians at the heart of his theology on the basis of literary interpretation. This was the dispute between Erasmus and Luther. Erasmus's diatribe De Libero Arbitratio, I think that's right. I'm assuming this is all Latin, and I don't speak Latin, so there you go. I know a little bit of Greek, but I don't know Latin. But he provoked Luther into a trenchant literary and theological tour de force. The most illustrious of humanists challenged the most controversial of theologians at the heart of his theology on the basis of literary interpretation. This was the dispute between Erasmus and Luther. Now, Erasmus, he set out on this diatribe against Luther. One of the notable works of this is Libero Arbitrio, and he provokes Luther into a trenchant literary and theological all-out battle. And in that work, as well as in another work of his called De Servo Arbitrio, he just goes to task with Luther and really begins to pick him apart. Now, they were contemporaries, and in some regards they were friends and they were colleagues, but they didn't agree on everything. But the important thing is that there was even this division. It kind of marked a schism in the early, Protestant doctrines at the time, and but a little bit more about Erasmus is that he was known first as an educator, and in 1500 he was an educator primarily through his collections of adages from the writers of Greece and Rome, and in later editions from Christian writers as well. In subsequent years, he published formal treatises on education to assist teachers, one of which was On the Right Method of Instruction, 1511. And students, he had a work called On Copia of Words and Ideas, 1512. At length, he even wrote for the education of future rulers, The Education of a Christian Prince, in 1516. In 1501, Erasmus wrote his first work of theology, and it was called A Handbook of a Christian Soldier, published in 1503, a treatise whose ideas found their way after a long process of development into Erasmus's paraphrases of the New Testament, which was 1517 and following. Satire, though, which your text brings this text up, came full-blown in the head of a mature thinker who was Erasmus in the form of The Praise of Folly, 1509, and then published in 1511. It was followed by a number of essays and dialogues in which Erasmus castigated the powerful for their waywardness and called them back to responsibility. Another very interesting fact about the work of Erasmus is his work with Greek manuscripts for the New Testament. And he put together a Greek Bible, a New Testament, with the best of his available manuscripts at the time, which is very significant because this second edition in 1519 that Erasmus put together is the same Greek source that Luther uses whenever he puts together his work of the New Testament in German. And so it's interesting that although Luther and Erasmus had some disagreement, Luther definitely acknowledged the fact that Erasmus had done the work, the due diligence of putting together a very reliable source of Greek text of the manuscripts for the New Testament. So Erasmus, as I said, was the leading Christian humanist of his day. He led the critical study of the Bible and writings of the church fathers. Martin Luther was the voice of the Protestant Reformation. And in 1517, the call for church reform was posted on the Wittenberg Cathedral's door and was titled the 95 Theses. Now, I have to give you a little bit of my experience when I was there. when you walk into this little tiny town where Luther was from and where he posted his theses on the door, you walk up to the side of this giant church, the Castle Church, and on the side there they've got this giant inscripted wall of the 95 Theses actually typed out. In fact, I was also able to get a copy, in a little pamphlet form from inside the church of the 95 Theses, and so, which is, I guess, pretty neat. We also, while we were there, we picked up a Luther Bible, his translation of the Bible. But I have to say, though, Luther never really, and your book will tell you that he did, and just about 95% of all sources will say this, but Luther never actually nailed his thesis to the door. His pointed questioning of the Roman Catholic Church ushered in one of the most tumultuous periods of religious, political, and social upheaval in European history. But today, the majority of Luther's researchers see it as a fact that Luther did not nail his thesis to the door of the Castle Church on that day. We know now that Luther actually just posted them, in a sense, to his bishop and to Albrecht of Brandenburg, the elector and archbishop of Mainz. And so there's this great story and this great image, and even when you visit the town, there it is on the door, and they sort of played along with the the myth side of the event. But needless to say, there were 95 Theses, and they were printed, and they were mass distributed, and they were submitted to church authority, and Luther himself stood up and proclaimed and preached and taught these things, and it was an act of rebellion to the Catholic Church. Just plain and simple. So whether or not he ever actually nailed any physical paper to any physical door really doesn't matter. Because we have a lot of evidence of what Luther accomplished. And anyway, so there you go. So this act of rebellion to the Catholic Church creates this stir. It's not. It was not a good time. At the time you had Lutherans who were killing Catholics because they weren't Protestant. Then you had this violent reaction from those who were Catholic against those who were attempting to reform, and it was a scary time. And then there was the peasant revolt, the peasant wars that rise up in response to this time, and it was not a good time in history. And it was a revolution. It literally. The world changed as these people knew it. But German princes, they had to either hold fast to their allegiance to Rome, or they banded together under this new name of the Lutherans. And as I mentioned a minute ago with Frederick the Wise, he is an example of one of these princes that had to sort of step back from the authority of Rome and say, we're going to protest, we're going to reform, and he, like I said, he had Luther's back. He was behind him, and honestly, if he hadn't, I don't think Luther would have lived. But Frederick the Wise, also known as Frederick III, the Elector of Saxony, was one of the most influential princes in the 16th century German political landscape. Without the political protection of Frederick, Martin Luther and the Reformation would have never survived. This is what scholars say. Now, when Luther appeared at the Diet of Worms in 1521, there was a man named Peutinger who was an Augsburg city authority and a humanist, but he was also interested in reform. And he advised Frederick the Wise on how to secure Luther's safety, and they worked behind the scenes in an attempt to prevent Luther's condemnation. And so part of Luther's appearance before the Diet of Worms, where he says, we have this great, I cannot, I will not, I shall not, recant, here I stand, which is also interesting because, a lot of historians say much of what we think he said that day is not actually true. But anyway, either way, we know for a fact he stood there and he was on trial before the Emperor of Rome. And but when he appears there in 1521, he has Frederick the Wise on his side, and part of the agreement was that we'll bring him in there, we'll let him be on trial, but you can't kill him, you just have to give him a chance. And so he had political favor with Frederick the Wise. And then when he leaves there, Frederick the Wise sets up to come and kidnap Luther and take him to Eisenach, and there's a castle there. I think it's the Wartburg Castle, and basically there's a moment he transitions. He has like this transitional point in his life where he no longer is a monk, and he sort of becomes this new identity. He even pretends to be somebody. He grows his hair out, and he's like hunting, and he's imprisoned here in this castle. He does a lot of his writing there, and he was actually struggling with a lot of health issues, and you can read some of his letters and his collected works of how he was not feeling well. Constipated, actually, I think, was the exact issue. And there's actually some interesting medical journals that have done articles based on the way Luther described his symptoms, and they're able to diagnose what they think it may have been, something to do with his kidneys. Anyway, just a side note on that. But so in 1521, he goes to the Diet of Worms, and he's got Frederick the Wise on his side, a prince who has said, we're gonna not hold too strongly to our allegiance to Rome, and we're going to sort of step back and take the side of the reformers. So when Luther appeared before the imperial court, he was ambushed. They didn't bring any theological scholars in to really challenge his doctrines. They just basically laid out all of his works. They didn't request him to clarify any of his doctrines, but they wanted him to recant of his whole corpus. I mean, everything he'd ever done. They wanted him to just say, you know what, I was wrong, sorry, I shouldn't have said any of that. The Diet demanded an unadorned yes or no to the following questions. Do you, Martin Luther, recognize the published works under your name as your own? Yes. Are you prepared to recant what you have written in these books? Well, no. And so, as you can see, it's very interesting because they could have killed him. I mean, they could have burned him alive and drawn and quartered him and drug him through the streets. But he had a little bit of favor because Frederick the Wise was there. We don't really know how the world would have gone forward from this point if Luther had died. I mean, it's hard to say, but he didn't. And he sort of, in a proverbial sense, slips his head out of that papal noose and backs out the door and walks away. And they never really get their hold on him again. But Luther's primary origin of concern appears to have been theological. And it was a concern about the process of reconciliation, or as he called it, more often than not, the process of justification. Now, this is very important because in Catholicism, there was a belief that the church is the one who saves you, and the sacraments are necessary for salvation. And, I could go through all 7 of the sacraments. I actually do that in another lecture, so we won't go there today. But the sacraments were meant to basically secure the salvation of the believer, the Christian, the Catholic, the follower of Christ. But Luther comes along and says, no, it's by faith. It's that you believe unto salvation. You believe on Christ, and it's grace imparted to you, and it's righteousness imputed to you, and you're given this amazing grace that you can't earn, that you cannot do a sacrament to gain, that you don't need a priest to do anything for you. You just have to believe unto salvation. And again, this was radical. The church, people needed the church. They needed to be buried in the church cemetery. They needed to have their last rites so that they didn't go to purgatory. I mean, there was this great, crisis, feeling among believers if they didn't have their sacraments. And Luther comes along and he shakes all that. He says, no, that's not what the Bible says. And so, if you were to really try to summarize Luther's theology, or even Protestant theology, you can come down to what we call the 5 solae, the 5 solas, and those are the final authority of Scripture, sola scriptura, and which encouraged Bible translations in the vernacular, so people could read and know what the Bible said. That was part of the reason that the the people at the time didn't know really anything about what they believed other than what was told to them, because they couldn't read the original text themselves, because they didn't know how to read Latin, and they didn't know how to read Greek, and they didn't know how to read Hebrew. And so the Sola Scriptura would be the first one. Like I said, Luther translated the Bible into German. Protestantism also emphasized salvation by God's free grace, which is sola gratia, the finished redemptive work of Christ, Jesus as the only mediator between God and man, solus Christus, and justification by faith alone, sola fide, and the sovereign purpose and glory of God, soli Deo gloria. These 5 sola summarize the core teachings of Protestantism. So again, sola scriptura, sola gratia, sola Christus, sola fide, and soli Deo gloria. There were also several distinct types of Reformation, though, that were taking place in and around the same time as Luther throughout the rest of Europe, and we have to give a little bit of attention to them. Namely, we have the Anabaptists, we have the Calvinists, and we have the Anglican Church in England. The Anabaptists, now these are a really fascinating group, and they were extremely persecuted. I mean, there was actually cathedrals where they put the Anabaptists inside cages on the outside of the church, and they left them there. I mean, they did not like these Anabaptists, but the Anabaptists was a Zurich-based radical wing of Protestantism that rejected all 7 of the Catholic sacraments, turning instead to individual acceptance of God. And that is a pretty big breakaway to reject all 7 of the sacraments. The Zurich Council's edict to punish the Anabaptists by drowning, this is what's really interesting, was put into effect because of their rebellion to the system, so to speak. And they drowned them because it poured contempt on the Anabaptists, and it derided their practice of baptizing by immersion in water. That was their whole concept, was that, we want to be baptized, but you must be an adult, and you must be fully immersed. And they had this, and that went against, the baptism that they would do to infants in the Catholic Church. And there was also this challenge to the way other Protestants were thinking of the way they thought baptism should work. Some thought, what's the big deal? Baptize the child or baptize the adult? But the Anabaptists said, no, we want full immersion, and that is the only correct way to do it. And so they were hated for this, and there was a slogan of the day that expressed the fate of Anabaptists with kind of a ghoulish humor. And it was, "He who dips shall be dipped by drowning." And so they said, you guys want to get baptized? We'll baptize you. We're going to throw you in the river. And so they drowned many Anabaptists alive. They were victims of the Protestants and the Catholics. They were hanged, they were burned, they were drowned. They were even forced to jump to their deaths from the tops of haystacks onto spikes. I mean, they hated the Anabaptists. So with many centers of activity and different flavors of Anabaptism, the movement attracted a host of people with divergent religious views. Some Anabaptists were mystics and spiritualists. Others expected the imminent return of Christ. Some Anabaptists were pacifists. Others were not. But the movement at its core was nonviolent. In all, thousands of Anabaptists were martyred for their radical reformative views. And then there are the Calvinists. John Calvin. Calvinism was a Geneva-based Protestant sect that emphasized the predestined nature of humanity from birth for salvation or damnation. In fact, John Calvin's magnum opus, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, has an entire chapter devoted to this concept. The 21st chapter of the 3rd book is entitled Eternal Election, by which God has predestined some to salvation and others to destruction. John Calvin was born July 10th, 1509, in the small French town of Noyon, about 60 miles northeast of Paris, and died May 27th, 1564, in Geneva. Calvin's place in church history belongs first to his role as a leader of the Reformation in Geneva. Calvin believed human beings could never understand God as God. Human beings could only grasp God insofar as God chose to reveal himself. But because Calvin believed God to be a good father, as he so often said, he also believed God engaged in a process of accommodation in order to commune and communicate with his children. Calvin believed himself to be a prophet, a finding which must be taken more seriously by scholars interested in understanding Calvin and his thinking, both about himself and about his times. Calvin was a very important figure in the Reformation, and it's interesting because although Calvin and Luther were contemporaries in a sense, they never met personally. They never were face-to-face that we know of historically, but the two dominant views of Reformation that we know of would be Lutheranism and Calvinism. So usually when people think of the Reformation, we think of Calvin and Luther. I also think of Zwingli, but we won't go into Ulrich Zwingli today. but we will talk about the Anglicans. And let me explain, there's a difference, though, that you have to understand between what Calvin and Luther were trying to do, and even the Anabaptists or even Zwingli were trying to do. It was different than what the Anglican movement was about. Calvin and Luther, their primary focus was theological. I mean, they were saying they weren't trying to make a political move. However, what they did as a motivated theological concern ended up changing the political landscape dramatically. I mean, it had a political consequence. But the Anglican Church is different because in 1526, Henry VIII declared himself head of the Anglicans as he broke away from the Catholic Church for a political reason. The Church of England break away from Catholicism was very much different qualitatively. Where Calvin and Luther and the Anabaptist primary contention was theological, Henry VIII's agenda was much more political. Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope, who had the power to grant divorces, was unable to give his consent, and he said no. And this did not make Henry VIII very happy. Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn. He was in love and wanted a legitimate male heir. He had a daughter with Catherine of Aragon, but he needed a male son, and he was convinced Catherine of Aragon was never going to give him the male heir son that he needed, so he wanted to divorce her and he wanted to marry this other woman. But Pope Clement the Seventh was a virtual prisoner of Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and refused to give dispensation. So there was this interesting sort of entangled web of, family and politics, and it really didn't make Henry VIII happy. But he's thinking, well, I'm king, so I could do what I want. So the king divorces Catherine, and he marries Anne Boleyn. He draws up this act of succession, which required his subjects to take an oath to recognize his marriage to Anne as a true marriage, and his children by her to be heirs to the English throne, and that all should reject the authority of the Pope. And so there we have a summary of the Protestant Reformation, kind of. Like I said, there's so much to this that we could go on and on and on and on, but just to give you a good general introduction, and this doesn't even cover everything that's in your book, so of course always read your book. I'm going to give you lectures that are mostly going to center around the history of ideas and intellectual history, or anything that has to do with religion and theology, because that is actually what I study. So here we have a breakdown of how the printing press comes into the picture. Luther, is the voice of the Reformation. The printing press is the technological innovation that spurred the Protestant Reformation. Kind of moved out of this devotio moderna and humanism, and some of the big names of humanism we have are Philip Melanchthon and Erasmus, and then in the Reformation we've got Luther and Calvin, and we've got the Anabaptists, and we've got good old Henry VIII with the Anglican Church there in England. And being that Martin Luther was the quintessential Renaissance man, he didn't limit his creative output to simply being a theologian, a polemic writer, and a critical thinker. He was also a hymn writer. So as we close out, we will hear a small selection from A Mighty Fortress Is Our God.